Picture this. It is 0317 local time in the Persian Gulf. A very large crude carrier, 330 meters of steel riding low under 2 million barrels of Arabian heavy crude, is threading the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. The water here is 39 kilometers wide, and the navigable channel, the lane where tankers of this size can actually move, is barely 3 kilometers across. On the Iranian shore to the north, Revolutionary Guard patrol boats sit dark and idle in the shallows. On the Omani shore to the south, a radar installation sweeps the surface every 4 seconds. The tanker's crew knows all of this. They have been trained for all of this. And yet the tension in the bridge tonight is not about the boats or the radar. It is about a question that no one in that bridge has a clean answer to. Who exactly is this choke point working for right now? That is the question this entire video is built around, because here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. The latest round of American pressure on Iranian oil exports, designed to strangle Tehran's revenue, to increase U.S. leverage in nuclear negotiations, and to tighten the economic vice, has, through a chain of consequences that no strategist in Washington fully anticipated, handed China a degree of structural influence over the world's most critical waterway that Beijing could not have purchased, engineered, or seized by force. China did not fire a single missile. It did not bribe a single admiral. It simply waited, kept buying, and let Washington's own policy architecture do the rest. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how American sanctions pressure inadvertently restructured the buyer base for Hormuz oil in China's favor, why that shift gives Beijing economic leverage it has never held before, and what the 3 realistic scenarios are for how this plays out, including the one that strategic analysts discuss privately but that no government will name publicly. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to May 8, 2018. That is the date Donald Trump signed the presidential memorandum withdrawing the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and initiating a maximum pressure campaign designed to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero. The policy had a name, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, combined with executive reimposition of oil sanctions with a specific 180-day wind-down clock. The logic was clean, at least on paper. Cut Iran's oil revenue, increase economic pain, bring Tehran back to the table under worse conditions, and extract a more comprehensive agreement. What happened instead was a lesson in the unintended architecture of global energy markets. By late 2018, Iranian exports had fallen from approximately 5 million barrels per day to roughly 1 million. Several traditional buyers, South Korea, Japan, India, the European Union, complied with American sanctions under the pressure of secondary sanctions risk. The threat that any financial institution or company that continued buying Iranian crude could be cut off from the US dollar clearing system. That threat is not theoretical. It is existential for any major bank with dollar-denominated exposure. So they stopped. China did not stop. China's state-owned refiners, Sinopec, PetroChina, Zhuhai Zhenrong, continued taking Iranian crude, though they initially reduced volumes and structured purchases through intermediaries, shadow tankers, and Emirati front companies to limit exposure. What they were doing, quietly and systematically, was something more important than mere defiance. They were becoming the residual buyer, the buyer of last resort. The single counterparty without whom the Iranian oil sector would have no functioning export market at all. By 2020, estimates from Capillaire, Vortexa, and the Energy Intelligence Group placed China's share of Iranian oil exports at somewhere between 85 and 95%. Think about that number carefully. 90% of one of the world's top 10 oil producers' export revenue runs through a single buyer relationship. In commercial terms, that is not a customer. That is a dependency, and dependency flows in both directions, except not symmetrically. Tehran needed Beijing to survive. Beijing needed Tehran to be cheap. And that asymmetry, that quiet, structural, never publicly announced asymmetry, is the hidden architecture of what we are now watching play out at the Strait of Hormuz. Let us now examine the military dimension of this story, because it is inseparable from the economic one, and it is more complex than the headlines suggest. The Strait of Hormuz is not a passive geography. It is an actively contested military environment. Iran has spent 25 years building what strategists call an anti-access, area denial architecture, a layered weapons system designed not to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle, which Iran cannot do, but to make operating in and around the Strait expensive, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic for commercial shipping. That architecture has 3 tiers. The first is surface. Iran operates a fleet of small, fast attack craft, primarily the PACAP-2 and Blade Runner-derived vessels, capable of speeds above 50 knots, that use swarming tactics designed to overwhelm the close-in defense systems of larger warships. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, has rehearsed these swarm scenarios in exercises named Great Prophet and Zulfiqar, some observed by U.S. Navy intelligence assets as recently as 2023. The second tier is subsurface. Iran has a submarine fleet, including 3 Russian-built Kilo-class boats and a growing number of domestically produced midget submarines, the Ghadir class, of which Iran has reportedly commissioned more than 20 units. These are not blue water submarines. They are shallow water, cluttered acoustic environment vessels designed specifically for the Persian Gulf, where the bottom is close, the water is warm and thermocline layered, and detection is genuinely difficult. The third tier is the one that changed everything after 2019. Precision ballistic and cruise missiles, the Fateh 1 and 10, and its derivatives. The Noor anti-ship cruise missile, itself derived from the Chinese C-802 platform, which is not a minor detail, as we will return to. And most significantly, the Zulfikar ballistic missile, a solid-fueled road-mobile system with a range of approximately 700 kilometers, and a claimed circular error probable of under 10 meters against fixed targets. When Iran struck the Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq in January 2020, in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani, it fired 16 Qiyam and Fateh 110 variant missiles. 12 of them hit within the designated target boxes. That was not luck. That was a demonstrated precision strike capability that had not been operationally confirmed at scale before. Here is something that no military strategist had fully expected. The combination of precision strike capability with a credible swarm harassment layer created what analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies now describe as a cost imposition zone, stretching from the entrance of the Gulf of Oman to the northern reaches of the Persian Gulf. Approximately 1,000 kilometers of water in which commercial shipping faces a non-trivial probability of interdiction or damage, even absent a declared war. And here is the strategic pivot that Beijing has been quietly processing for 3 years. China's Noor-derived anti-ship cruise missile technology, transferred to Iran in the 1990s and subsequently developed domestically by Iran into the Noor and Qadr families, means that if Iran were ever to close or severely restrict the Strait, the weapons doing the closing would have Chinese DNA. China has plausible deniability on any Iranian military action, but it has structural foreknowledge of Iranian capability in a way no other outside power does. Watch the weapons, watch the buyers, watch the beneficiaries. Those 3 facts, held together, tell you who actually benefits from this military architecture without ever pulling a trigger. Now let us connect the military reality to your economy, because this is where the story stops being geopolitical abstraction and starts being the price of things you buy every week. When the current round of maximum pressure enforcement tightened in early 2024, with the Biden administration announcing it would close sanctions waivers and increase enforcement actions against shadow fleet tankers carrying Iranian crude, the immediate market reaction was predictable. Brent crude moved from $82 per barrel to $91 per barrel in the space of 11 trading days. That is not a dramatic spike in historical terms. But it is the kind of sustained elevation that transmission mechanisms into consumer prices with a 6 to 8 week lag. Here's how that transmission works. Iranian crude, priced at a sanctions discount of approximately $10 to $15 per barrel below the benchmark, feeds primarily into Chinese teapot refineries, small independent processors concentrated in Shandong province that handle approximately 5 million barrels per day of total capacity. When Iranian supply is constrained, those refineries must either reduce throughput or bid for replacement barrels on the open market. When they bid on the open market, they compete with South Korean and Japanese buyers for the same Arab Light and Murban cargoes that were already tight. Benchmark prices rise, refinery margins tighten, refined product costs increase. Freight costs, already elevated by Red Sea disruption adding 10 to 14 days to Europe-Asia routing, compound the pressure. And at the end of that chain, somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks later, the price of a liter of fuel at a petrol station in Lahore, in Jakarta, in Nairobi, in Sao Paulo, ticks upward by an amount that no headline connects back to a sanctions enforcement memo signed in Washington. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a Treasury Department enforcement action to the price of fuel in your city. The countries most exposed to this transmission mechanism are the ones with the lowest strategic petroleum reserves relative to consumption. Japan holds approximately 150 days of import cover, split between government and commercial stocks. It has institutional resilience. South Korea holds roughly 100 days. India, critically, holds between 9 and 18 days of government strategic reserve, with total system stocks including commercial inventory reaching perhaps 65 to 70 days. The Indian economy's sensitivity to oil price spikes is structurally higher than almost any other major Asian economy because petroleum products constitute such a large share of the import bill, and because retail fuel prices, though partially subsidized, eventually transmit into food transport costs, agricultural input costs, and manufactured goods costs across the entire economy. China, by contrast, holds approximately 90 days of strategic reserve in its official SPR, with substantial additional commercial inventory. And it is buying Iranian crude at discounts of $10 to $15 per barrel below Brent. Run the arithmetic. On 1, 5 million barrels per day of Iranian origin crude, the current estimated volume, China is capturing a cost advantage of $15 to $22 million per day relative to what it would pay at benchmark prices. That is roughly $5 to $8 billion per year in direct energy cost savings. That money funds Belt and Road disbursements. It funds EV manufacturing subsidy capacity. It funds the Strategic Petroleum Reserve expansion that China has been quietly accelerating since 2022. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. Because the downstream story, what happens when China converts that energy cost advantage into industrial pricing power, is the next layer of this, and it is already beginning to show up in trade data. The food and fertilizer connection is not secondary. Iran is also a major producer of urea-based fertilizers, and the same sanctions architecture that constrains its oil exports constrains its fertilizer exports. Countries in South Asia and East Africa that previously sourced Iranian urea at below-market prices have been forced to alternative suppliers, primarily from Russia, Qatar, and China, at higher prices. When fertilizer costs rise, farm input costs rise. When farm input costs rise, food prices follow. The IMF's Commodity Price Index has tracked this correlation with remarkable consistency across 3 previous sanctions cycles. The current cycle is no different. Now let us map the diplomatic chessboard, because the military and economic pressures we have just described are all operating within a diplomatic framework that is far more complicated than the public positions suggest. The formal American position, as articulated by the State Department and Treasury, is that maximum pressure exists to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability and to constrain its regional proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various Iraqi Shia militia. Those are legitimate security objectives, and no serious analyst disputes the rationale entirely. The question is whether the tool being used is producing the outcome being sought. The private Iranian position, as understood through back-channel communications that have passed through Omani intermediaries, specifically through the office of Sultan Haytham bin Tariq al-Said, who has maintained Muscat's traditional role as the region's quiet diplomatic bridge, is that Tehran is willing to discuss nuclear limits in exchange for meaningful sanctions relief, but not under conditions of maximum economic pressure, which it reads as an attempt to force regime capitulation rather than genuine negotiation. That gap between Washington's stated goal, nuclear limitation, and Tehran's reading of the actual goal, regime change by economic suffocation, is the core diplomatic impasse, and it has not narrowed materially since 2019. China's public position is that it supports a diplomatic resolution, opposes unilateral sanctions, and will continue engaging with Iran as a matter of sovereign bilateral trade policy. China's private incentive is to maintain exactly the status quo, an Iran dependent enough on Chinese purchasing that Beijing has significant influence over Iranian policy decisions, but not so diplomatically isolated that it implodes in a way that disrupts Chinese energy supply chains. Beijing does not want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, because a nuclear Iran raises the probability of Israeli or American military action that could disrupt the Strait. But it also does not want Iran to fully normalize with the West, because full normalization would allow European and Indian buyers back into the market, reducing Iran's China dependency and Beijing's leverage. The optimal outcome for Beijing is a permanently semi-isolated Iran that sells oil exclusively to China at a 15% discount forever. And the current diplomatic architecture, however unintentionally, is delivering precisely that. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, have their own layered interests. Saudi Arabia benefits from elevated oil prices that result from Iranian supply restrictions. But it does not benefit from a destabilized strait through which its own exports must pass. Riyadh has been quietly expanding its own Chinese market relationships, with Saudi Aramco having signed a series of long-term supply agreements with Sinopec and CNOOC that represent a strategic hedge against Western demand decline driven by energy transition. The Abraham Accords-era normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel created a brief moment of potential regional security architecture, but the October 2023 Gaza crisis fractured that public alignment, even if the private security relationships remain partially intact. Turkey occupies a position worth noting. Ankara has consistently refused to join sanctions coalitions against Iran, maintains active trade relationships, and has positioned itself as a potential dialogue facilitator. But Turkey's own economic vulnerabilities, high inflation, currency pressure, energy import dependency, limit how much diplomatic weight it can actually apply. Pakistan, similarly, has pursued a pragmatic bilateral energy relationship with Iran, including the partially constructed Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, which has become a recurring point of tension with Washington over secondary sanctions exposure. The gap between all of these public positions and private incentives is where the actual diplomacy lives. And what that gap tells you is that no party currently has a strong enough incentive to pay the domestic political cost of a genuine negotiated resolution. Which brings us to the three scenarios that analysts are actually gaming out right now. The first is a negotiated resolution. For this to happen, several things must occur simultaneously, and the sequencing matters enormously. The United States would need to offer a phased sanctions relief package, not full normalization, but enough to allow Iran to reactivate oil exports to European and Asian buyers at meaningful volumes. Iran would need to accept intrusive IAEA monitoring of its enrichment program and agree to an enrichment cap below weapons-grade threshold. The Gulf states would need to accept that some Iranian re-entry into the energy market would put modest downward pressure on oil prices, and China would need to tacitly accept that its privileged buyer status would diminish as Iranian supply diversified. This scenario is possible. The negotiating framework exists. The JCPOA architecture, though legally dead, is a template that both sides have used before. The problem is domestic politics. In Washington, any agreement with Iran is immediately framed as appeasement by political opponents, regardless of its security merits. In Tehran, the Supreme Leader's office has consistently framed sanctions as proof of American bad faith, making concession politically costly for reformist factions. The narrow pathway exists, but it requires political leaders in both capitals to absorb domestic criticism for the sake of a deal whose benefits are structural and long-term in political environments that reward short-term positioning. History suggests this pathway has traveled rarely and only under extraordinary pressure. The second scenario is continued attrition. This is the most likely near-term outcome, not because anyone wants it, but because it requires the least active decision. Iranian oil continues to flow to China at discount prices. American sanctions enforcement continues to tighten around the shadow fleet. Tanker insurance costs for Gulf shipments remain elevated at 2 to 0. 4% of hull value per voyage, a significant premium. Regional tensions periodically spike, as they have done in cycles since 2019. Drone strikes, tanker seizures, naval confrontations, without crossing into full-scale military conflict. Global oil prices oscillate between $80 and $100 per barrel, high enough to sustain Gulf state revenue, low enough to avoid a full demand destruction recession in major consumer economies. China continues to accumulate energy cost advantage and leverage over Iranian policy. And the structural shift that we have been describing, China's quiet positioning as the indispensable buyer of Hormuz-adjacent oil, deepens week by week without ever making the front page of a newspaper. This scenario is economically painful for oil-importing nations, in a diffuse, distributed way that makes political mobilization against it difficult. The pain is real, in fuel prices, in fertilizer costs, in freight rates, but it is not acute enough to force a political crisis. It is the worst of all worlds for countries like India and Japan, which face sustained elevated import costs without the leverage that either Chinese purchasing power or American financial infrastructure would give them. The third scenario is the one that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. Here's the chain of events that defines it. A miscalculation, not a decision, but a miscalculation, during one of the periodic Iranian harassment operations in the Strait results in the deaths of sailors from a NATO member state or a close American ally. Washington faces domestic pressure to respond militarily. A targeted strike package against IRGCN naval infrastructure is authorized. Iran responds, as its military doctrine requires it to, with a simultaneous multi-axis escalation, ballistic missile strikes against Gulf state energy infrastructure, activation of Houthi and Hezbollah missile platforms against Israeli territory, and a declared intention to mine the Strait. Not the closing of the Strait. Iran cannot hold the Strait closed against a sustained U.S. naval operation, but the credible threat of mining sufficient to cause a 30 to 60-day interruption of commercial transit. In that scenario, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. Approximately 17 to 21 million barrels of oil per day transit the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 20% of global petroleum supply. A 60-day interruption at full volume would remove something in the range of 1 to 1. 2 billion barrels from global supply, more than the entire strategic petroleum reserve of the United States. Brent crude price modeling from Goldman Sachs' Commodity Research Desk has suggested a full interruption scenario could push prices above $150 per barrel within 30 days. At $150 per barrel, the arithmetic of global economic growth changes fundamentally. Import-dependent nations with thin reserves, India, many African economies, Southeast Asia, face genuine fiscal crises. Airline fuel costs become prohibitive for many routes. Fertilizer prices double. Food prices follow with a 90-day lag. And in that scenario, the diplomatic architecture that exists to manage the crisis runs through Beijing. Because Tehran, facing maximum military pressure, would be talking primarily to the one counterparty whose continued purchasing relationship it cannot afford to lose. China would be the indispensable intermediary, Not because it engineered the crisis, but because the structure of Iranian oil dependency that we have spent this entire video describing means that Beijing is the only party with both the economic leverage to pressure Tehran and the bilateral relationship to be heard. That is the scenario. That is the scenario no government will name publicly. And that is the scenario in which China's quiet structural positioning, accumulated not through military force but through patient systematic purchasing, would convert into overt geopolitical power at a scale that would reshape the post-Cold War order. The Hormuz that existed before this sanctions cycle is not coming back. The buyer structure has been altered. The dependency relationships have been rewritten, and the party that benefits most has not fired a single shot. Let me put this in concrete terms before we close. You are standing in a petrol station in your city. The price per liter is higher than it was 2 years ago. You are pushing a trolley through a supermarket. The price of bread, of cooking oil, of packaged goods with long supply chains has crept upward in a way that feels diffuse and disconnected from any single cause. You are booking a flight. The fuel surcharge has quietly doubled from what it was in 2022. You are a farmer in Punjab or Maharashtra or the Nile Delta, and the urea you need for your next planting cycle costs more this year than last. None of those experiences announces itself as a consequence of the Strait of Hormuz. None of them comes with a news banner explaining that a Treasury Department sanction designation, a Chinese state refinery purchase agreement, and an Iranian naval doctrine are the upstream causes of your downstream cost of living. But they are, that is the direct line, from the maximum pressure policy, to the restructured buyer base, to the Chinese cost advantage, to the global commodity pricing that sits beneath everything you purchase. Watch the tanker traffic. Watch the sanctions designation lists. Watch the Beijing-Tehran bilateral trade data. Those 3 data streams, read together, will tell you more about where oil prices are going in the next 12 months than any OPEC communique. And here is the historical weight of this moment. The United States has spent 3 decades, from the Gulf War forward, maintaining freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf as an expression of American power and global public goods provision. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, has been the structural guarantor of a shipping lane that benefits not just American consumers, but every economy on Earth that depends on seaborne energy trade. That role has been credible, costly, and largely uncontested. What the sanctions architecture has inadvertently done is create a parallel structural layer, not a military challenge to American naval supremacy, which remains real, but an economic layer in which the most important relationship for the commercial viability of that shipping lane is not between Washington and the Gulf, but between Beijing and Tehran. America still controls the guns in the Gulf. China now controls the economics. And in a world where energy markets are the substrate of everything, food prices, manufacturing costs, sovereign fiscal capacity, the distinction between those 2 kinds of control is narrowing in ways that matter enormously. The open question, the one that this video cannot answer and that will determine what comes next, is this. Will the next American administration recognize that the sanctions architecture has produced a China dividend that was never part of the policy intention? And if it does recognize it, does it have the political will and the diplomatic creativity to restructure that architecture in a way that actually serves American interests, without simply handing Iran a windfall that it will use to further destabilize the region? That answer does not exist yet. It is being written right now in back-channel conversations in Muscat and Geneva and Beijing, in Treasury Department policy reviews, in Iranian Supreme Leader deliberations, and in the purchase orders of Chinese state refineries in Shandong province. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.